And I have the great pleasure tonight of introducing a talk by my former colleague, Kasia Regis, on the work of Willem Sasnal to time with the close of the exhibition, Willem Sasnal, Such a Landscape, at the Museum of the History of Polish Jews. Kasia Regis is artistic director at Canal Centre Pompidou in Brussels. Before that, she was the senior curator at Tate Liverpool, where she was responsible for the programme of exhibitions, collection displays, and international collaborations. While there, she curated major exhibitions of the work of Maria Lasnik, Edward Krasinski, and Lucy Mackenzie, which I saw in December and was fantastic, among other projects. Between 2010 and 2015, she was an assistant curator at Tate Modern, where I was working as well. And we worked together on a couple of great shows, including retrospectives of Alighiero, Boetti, and Sigmar Polka. Her recent independent projects include the Art Encounters Biennial in 2021, the inauguration of the Museum Such, and Otwalk, a long-term collaboration with Miroslav Balka, whose work I'm sure is familiar to many of you listening tonight. Today, Kasia will be giving a talk which is connected to an essay that she wrote in the major monograph on Sasnal published by Rizzoli. The essay was called Images After Willem Sasnal's Uses and Abuses of Abstraction. Just to let you know the format of this evening, Kasia will be talking for about half an hour. During that time or afterwards, please feel free to submit questions via the YouTube channel. You can also submit questions in Polish, and they'll be translated and asked after the lecture. Immediately after the lecture, Kasia and I will engage in a short discussion, and then we'll take the questions that have come in from the audience. So thank you very much for inviting me to introduce Kasia. And Kasia, take it away.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for joining us here tonight. Thank you to Pauline for inviting us. Congratulations once again on a great and important exhibition. Congratulations to Adam Szymczyk, to the whole museum, and to Wilhelm Sasnal as well. I'll be speaking for about 30 minutes, and I was asked today, for this presentation today, I was asked to choose one painting from the exhibition at Pauline as a point of departure. And quite predictably, I chose one of the iconic works, Shoah Forest from 2003. And next slide, please. Whereas the artist describes is it in the exhibition guide that he has drawn, Jan Piwoński, a witness, Claude Lanzmann, film director, Barbara Janicka, interpreter, are coming out of a forest in Sobibór. Much has been said about this painting and Sasnal's way of narrating difficult stories and histories. Much of literature about his practice covers this area of his work. So instead of the painting's content, I decided to focus tonight on the gesture, those wide dynamic brushstrokes and meanders of green paint covering most of the canvas. So this presentation decodes the possible meanings behind this Sasnal's use of abstract forms. And next slide, please. June 2003, a crowded Concorde flight from London to New York, just a few months before the aircraft was withdrawn from service. And Wilhelm Sasnal is on board of this flight, living out his fantasy of supersonic journey. The Concorde, which was this technological miracle and ecological nightmare, this embodiment of a futurist utopia and dreams of time travel, captured the imagination of thousands while serving only a few. For many, especially those on the eastern side of the Iron Curtain, that included Sasnal himself, the aircraft represented a desire, and a desire that was never to be fulfilled. So this luxurious plane, this object of desire, features in Sasnal's many works, including a series of paintings depicting the infamous crash near Charles de Gaulle Airport from the year 2000, a crash that killed 113 people And ultimately, it brought the supersonic era in aviation to its end. And next slide, please. Untitled from 2000, for instance, depicts a seemingly abstract form, a combination of black lines composing an L-shaped object set against a completely white, flat background. This unimpressive painting represents, in the 1:1 scale, a metal part from the hull of the aircraft that is believed to have caused the crash. This reductive approach is very calculated, it's very precise, and it hints at the banality of the disaster. So alongside those meandering brush strokes that I just shown, objects isolated from their original contexts or enlarged to the point of losing their identity feature prominently among Sasnell's signature motifs. Details become dramatic figures, anchoring the narrative behind the artist's works. This method is grounded in a paradox. In Sasnell's work, the real subject is often invisible, visually removed. He is not an abstract painter, yet he's neither a realist. Most of his abstract, or at least ostensibly abstract works, created over the past 2 decades, are strongly rooted in reality, a reality which is faulty, banal, and lacking. So abstraction as a metaphor can stand for this deficiency. But Sasnell's painting is not allegorical. He employs abstraction as a method of representation, and in his work, it enhances its narrative aspect. Those seemingly marginal, the abstraction intensifies his storytelling by creating space where the act of seeing takes place in the viewer's response. And this response comes into play when it comes to interpretation of the work. And after all, the wider the margin, the more room for personal notes. So let me get back to this journey of Sasnell and the Concorde. He boarded the plane with an intention to register his experience. Using a Super 8 camera, which he often took with him on his travels, the artist filmed for the entire duration of his transatlantic flight, so only just over 3 hours. And next slide, please. The resulting work is a short film called Concorde, which takes its title from the name of the aircraft. Like many of Sasnell's paintings, it oscillates between abstraction and figuration and documentation, and in doing so, it provides a very interesting insight into Sasnell's thinking about the image and physical gesture in the process of constructing the meaning of his works. Shot on Kodachrome, the film shows the sky seen through the window of the plane. At times, the image looks like a bright blue monochrome, a heavenly abstraction. There is no sound, no dramatic turns of action, nothing that could point to the excitement that should accompany the extraordinary event that is a supersonic journey. Sasnell commented, "The frame shows just the sky with a part of the plane window. It is completely visually unattractive. The image is slightly shaky, reminding the viewer of the artist's presence, of the fact that he holds the camera. The aircraft, the subject of the work, stays beyond the picture. The Concorde loses materiality. Its emblematic power, the majestic silhouette, is completely undermined." So with this film, Sasnell takes the denial of realistic representation even further. And that's because the way he displays it, using a projector with a thin strip of sandpaper inserted into its mechanism. So what happens is that the paper slowly scrapes away the looped tape as it runs through the device. At the time of Sasnell's journey, the Kodachrome, like all film, was being gradually withdrawn from production, replaced first by VHS, then by digital technology. Hence, Concorde was a swan song not only for one, but two projects that failed the test of time. But it is not the nostalgia inherent in the work that tells us the most about Sasnal's approach to form. Instead, it is interesting to think what happens to the image he registered, how the film's repeated projection will bring it to an end and the viewer to the point of not seeing. The value of filmic record and of the artist and the viewer's relationship to visual evidence are questioned. And there is a considerable level of violence in Sasnal's destructive gesture. And we can see it sometimes repeated in other works. There is for instance, an ostensibly abstract painting, a negative, I don't have the image of it. But it's the thick layers of bright cream paint with hues of light pink, reminiscent of overexposed films. And it's quite harshly scratched. So does this maltreatment of the negative point to the photographic medium's intrinsic imperfection, its unreliability? Films and photographs fade away. Their interpretation is always subjective. In the case of Concorde, it is the potential lack of image, not the image itself, that constitutes the meaning of the work. And this omission will be quite important for the rest of the presentation. Next slide, please. Void, described by the title, is a phrase used by Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek in relation to Sasnal's painting Atomic Bomb. Next slide. And to the artist's signature representation strategies such as absence, omission, and emptiness. The painting is a simple composition with a large white plane occupying the majority of its surface. This vacant field is surrounded by an irregular, thickly textured yellowish border. Whether the painting depicts an explosion, its aftermath, or perhaps the magnified image of the particles that constitute the titular lethal weapon, that's unclear. The last interpretation brings to mind the photolithograph First View by Gerhard Richter. Next slide, please. This print that you can see is based on a clipping from a daily newspaper presenting a microscopic enlargement of the inside of an atom, the first one in history. The image appropriated by Richter alongside an excerpt of the accompanying article is just a blobby, biomorphic, indistinctive shape in various shades of gray. So despite of the technological breakthrough that the image heralded, on an unmediated visual level with no text, it bore no information to its viewers. And to say more about Richter, at the beginning of her essay analyzing his abstractions alongside his relationship to technology, photography, and their capacity to represent history, and that's an essay in the catalog that Mark actually edited. The American scholar Rachel Haidu recalls briefly another artist, Harun Farokhi's film, Images of the World and the Inscription of War from 1988. Next slide, please. The film is devoted to blind spots in the interpretation of the aerial photographs taken over the territory of occupied Poland during an American bombing raid in 1944. The historical images show an industrial target, the German IG Farben plant, where the poisonous gas Zyklon B was produced. The complex was situated just next to Auschwitz concentration camp. Its rigid structures were also captured on the photos. And this fact, this graphic evidence of seemingly invisible mass genocide was only discovered 3 decades after the images were taken. Farokhi's film is about a failure to see. Despite the existence of technology aimed at enhancing the very process of seeing. Making sense of images is up to the viewer, who must rely on his or her knowledge, her physical abilities. In her reading of Images of the World, Haidu links the systems of seeing with the art of the pre-war avant-garde. Next slide, please. So I'm going to quote her. Part of the reason why no one saw Auschwitz in the 1944 photographs was the unremarkable two-dimensional pattern that its buildings created in the photographs. The other part was failure of the imagination. This link between imagination and two-dimensional patterns is familiar to those of us who have followed the history of 20th century artistic abstraction. There, the dialectic between the optical impulse to see depth and the material insistence on painting surface is well known. Could a lesson in Cubist-style geometry have improved the Americans' ability to see in 1944? Had the images contained gestural expressionism that is conventionally considered suited to depictions of atrocity, would they have been more useful? Does the severe geometry of those, in fact, relate to the project of mass extermination, or even to related productivist ideals of efficiency and the superhuman? As dualistic as these questions may be, they point to the area that lies between technicity, the combinations of systems of knowledge and instruments of seeing, and art. Next slide. In the rare instances when Sasnal work enters into formal dialogue with the pre-war geometric abstraction, his approach reveals the mistrust of modernist aesthetic systems and utopias. In this painting, Sky Above São Paulo from 2005, this is the aerial view of urban structure. And the painting is a variation on the iconic geometric pattern of streets composing a modern city. While a regular grid of lines serves as a basis for the composition, there is nothing of Mondrian's rigidness or colorful optimism in this representation. Lines demarcating the city plan of the polluted Brazilian metropolis are hardly visible against the pitch black background. There is no clarity to this image, which in its abstraction recalls contemporary music more than the sounds evoked by de Mondrian's Broadway boogie woogie. It conjures the failures of modernist urban planning and social engineering rather than the neat grid evoked by the iconic Mondrian painting. So while the pre-war avant-garde and its legacies are not at the crux of Sasnal's practice, the historical moment and the phenomenon, analyzed first by Farocki and then by Hajdu, strongly resonate with his painting. Now, posed in the context of Polish art post-1945, Hajdu's questions about the relationship between knowledge, art, and the instruments of seeing don't offer the benefit of a doubt, something that she called a failure of imagination. But they chime with a more ethically charged reflection on what we failed to see, what we chose not to see, and what cannot be unseen. Next slide. Written shortly after the Second World War, The Theory of Vision by pioneering Polish constructivist Władysław Strzemiński is a text in which the author lays out his thesis that our visual perception of the ever-changing world is conditioned by our socio-historical experience, something that Strzemiński, the father of Polish avant-garde, calls visual consciousness. And they are also conditioned by the physicality of the human body. Strzemiński analyzed the mechanism of seeing and the human eye in physiological terms. His views are manifested in a series of works called After Images. Next slide. A group of paintings and drawings executed during and shortly after the war, in which abstract shapes are reflected on the retina after it is exposed to an object reflecting light or to a direct source of light. This is just one of the examples. The vibrations of Strzemiński's contours correspond to the trembling and movement of both his body and the image appearing under the eyelid. Sasnal is acutely aware of Strzemiński's theory, and the idea of the after image occasionally features in his works. For instance, in a 2004 painting, An Eyelid, next slide, which is almost monochromatic composition in shades of orange. And it conjures flickering spots of light we see when we close our eyes after looking at the sun. Next slide. A painting called The Sun from 2011 is a more impressionist take on the same phenomenon, while the Untitled 2019, and that's the next slide, and it's a painting feature in the exhibition at Polin. That's an after image par excellence. A shiny white loop twirls across Sasnau's large canvas covered with irregular patches of bright yellow paint. According to the artist, the painting represents his memory of sitting in a dentist's chair with his mouth wide open and his eyes gazing straight into the surgical light. So does the seemingly joyful image reflect the fear or pain of a medical procedure? Bringing emotions into the realm of the abstract is a useful exercise when it comes to the relationship between Strzemiński, Sasnał, and this binary opposition of realism and abstraction, which is at the core of this presentation. In her 2019 book, Strzemiński's Affect, art historian Louisa Nader proposes the reading of Strzemiński's theory alongside a series of so-called war drawings depicting scenes of violence and death observed by the artist during the Second World War. Nader's key instruments for deconstructing Strzemiński's text stem from neuroaesthetics and the affect theory. Linking Strzemiński's personal experience to his manifesto and practice, she goes on to trace the painter's presence in occupied Łódź and the reactions to the horrifying events unfolding in front of his eyes. Strzemiński must have passed the Litzmannstadt ghetto on a regular basis. This enclosed part of town, accommodating at once up to 200,000 people, and many of them Strzemiński's neighbors, friends, or students, wasn't hidden behind the wall. This vanishing life in the doomed quarter, the hunger, the violence, the executions were exposed for passers-by to see. So Nader positions Strzemiński as a witness of Shoah and treats his cycle In Memory of My Jewish Friends, made between 1945 and 6, next slide please, which concludes the series of war drawings as an opus devoted to the act of effective remembering of the Holocaust. The series is composed of 10 small collages that are all made of archival black and white photographs of ghettos and concentration camps, and drawings formally reminiscent of the after images, with some textual commentaries on the reverse of the works and the title defining each scene. Nader considers them in the category of neurotestimony, stressing that, I quote, all of those drawings are visual traces of an event, a moment of seeing, perhaps just a glimpse of an eye. At the same time, Strzemiński documented the vibrations of his own body, perhaps fear, perhaps anger, the helplessness, perhaps short-sightedness, knowledge and disbelief at the same moment. End of quote. So those quivering semi-defined forms accompanying the photographic representations of atrocities observed by the artist are both a visual record of a liminal experience and of a physical, emotional response of the body, as articulated in the theory of vision, but also the notion of affect, guilt, shame, fear, despair, joy, regret, mourning, embedded in Strzemiński's forms, activates the viewer, who is forced to decipher the images every time she looks at them. The viewer becomes a witness. Also for her, the abstract image serves as an account of an event and a trigger for physical reaction and emotional perception. Next slide. This mechanism is taken to the extreme in the sticky spot of crime. Next slide. the only collage in the series in which Strzemiński uses a bright color as key means of expression. The titular stain spills over the most of the composition, dominating the thin, vibrating contours of the drawing and the photography of an exhumed corpse, all isolated from one another and set against the white background. The rich shade of red is heavy and dense, like clotted blood. Its impact enforced by the work's visceral title is greater than the one of the photo of a decomposed body. Next slide. And here I'm quoting Nader again. The stain of red, which constitutes a visual and semantic dominant of the collage sticky spot of crime, invasively marks the visual field of the viewer. It settles on the retina as an afterimage, hollows the consciousness and subconsciousness, permanently settles in the memory. It arrests the gaze, forces the viewer to comprehend all the elements of the collage. It conveys intensity, the affect. Next slide, please. In 2001, Sasnal painted a series of 5 works based on Art Spiegelman's Pulitzer Prize-winning comic book, Maus. The comic book tells the story of war and Holocaust as experienced in Poland by the author's father, using simplified means. Humans are animals, Jews, mice, Germans, cats, Poles, pigs. The dramatic action unfolds in the form of a basic black and white cartoon. Sasnal translates the printed medium into painting, significantly enlarging the images. Next slide, please. In 4 of the works, he further manipulates them by isolating the background and removing all the characters and speech bubbles, marking their presence. In Maus 3, next slide, that's the most abstract work of the cycle. It shows a diagonal grid marking the surface of the wall and a checkerboard pattern of the floor. The only disruption of the otherwise rigidly minimal composition is a black blotch of paint in slower portion. The irregular shape looks like a printing error and only reveals its horrid meaning when the viewer starts to grasp the context of the work. As with the sticky spot of crime, it's the work's title which offers a clue as to the correct decoding of the abstract form. The painting presents an interior of a barrack in a concentration camp. The splatter is most likely a bloody stain. The horrific discovery happens gradually and takes the viewer by surprise. The process of making sense of dense diagonal lines and shapeless splashes of paint is accompanied by disgust, terror, denial, even though the truth is right there in front of our eyes, black on white, to use a Polish expression for something obvious and indisputable. The blot confronts the viewer with the corporeal reality of Sasnal's painting. It stays under the eyelids and sets the tone of our response to the work. The stain on the painting becomes a stain on the conscious the moment the viewer realizes that it embodies something real. In his interpretation of Sasnal's work, Zizek, who I quoted before, commented on the use of abstraction in the following way. Next slide, please. Don't the stains, which clouded the clarity of realistic representation, which impose themselves as stains, indeed indicate the contours of the established reality are blurred, that we are approaching the pre-ontological level of obscure proto-reality. This is a crucial transition for the viewer to make. The stains are not obstacles which defend the direct access to the represented reality. Quite the opposite. They are more real than the reality itself. Zizek's association of the stain with a visual obstacle is apt when applied to Sasnal's other abstract motives, such as the signature meanders of brushstrokes constituting formless mass, which dominates the composition in the paintings such as Shoah Forest which I started with, or Untitled After Metinides from 2003. Next slide, please. The visual testimony is hazy, but once the titles are deciphered and the textual commentary added, the viewer, seduced by the masterful handling of the paint, begins to consciously witness a catastrophe or its aftermath. She has no choice but to look, to observe. The expressive forms determine a slight movement of eyes and head, which follow Sasnau's convoluted lines in search of their meaning. What comes at the end of the labyrinth of trees or at the center of the amorphic mass of the thick impasto of paint forming the corpse, next slide please, is shock and denial. And next slide. Maybe fear or anger or maybe shame. We know our feelings more intimately than we know historical facts. Seen through the theory of affect, Sasnau's use of abstraction alongside figuration imposes a moral judgment on the viewer's position as an observer. To look away when confronting his paintings is ethically impossible. Closing your eyes is pointless. The image will chase you, imprinted on the retina of your eye. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kasia. That was fantastic. Really, really interesting. I'm very compelled by many of the different arguments you make about how abstraction sort of functions for Sasnau as a place where you imagine rather than see. And you know, I'm interested in that idea you take from Zizek as well, that the abstraction points to a reality that's not the simplistic reality of something that you see or that has a meaning, but the deeper reality of something. And I was wondering if we could just put up that image again of Shoah Forest from 2003. Obviously, the elaborate twirling, very thick brushstrokes in some way replace a background that one might imagine, which would be the standing trees of a forest. And the forest itself, once would be a place where painters from the Romantic period onwards, from Caspar David Friedrich onwards, would go to kind of take themselves away from the city to find a moment of, pure natural beauty. But the forest in the Shoah is a place of crime, of hiding people in the resistance movement. It's also a place of execution. It's also, forests were grown around some of the camps rows of trees were grown around some of the camps to make sure that people didn't see them from afar. So he replaces what we imagine to be trees with these brushstrokes. I was just wondering if you think that the ideas that are in this painting connect at all to ideas in other artists' paintings. And I've got an image here of a Gerhard Richter painting called Grey, which is one of a series of paintings. If we can just move ahead. If you can change the slide and just go ahead with the slide. In the late 60s and into the 70s, Gerhard Richter produced a group of paintings that he called Grey. And they were seen to be many different things for him. They were in some way a kind of rejection of the photographic images he'd been working with. But later he said that grey monochrome paintings were the only way for me to paint the concentration camps. And he said it was impossible to paint the misery of life except maybe in grey to cover it. I was just wondering, how you relate that moment of Richter using these swirling brushstrokes in these grey works that he later says are his attempt to deal with the camps, to a very different moment and geographical location, 2003, the point when Sasnau makes Forest.
Yeah, that's an interesting comparison and an apt one, despite the fact that they represent different generations, but also different nationalities, which in that context is quite key to what I think differs the two approaches. In a way, it's all about what the painter chooses to do to represent trauma. And for Richter, as he was closer to the generation to the moment of those atrocities, my feeling is that it was an inability to face the facts as based on his quote, or as Sasnal isn't a witness, but also his position as a Polish national is maybe more ambiguous. His paintings are maybe not about his ability of facing the facts, but about the faulty historical narratives that surrounded Shoah and Holocaust in Poland, and much of literature about his practice is devoted to that fact, this haziness of telling and retelling certain histories and the relation of how we want to remember to the facts, but also how we want or choose to remember certain things. So the blur in Richter's painting is a bit different. The next slide, I think, is another great painting. And then we have the next one is September, which is much later. It's almost contemporary to Shoah. And we spoke about Richter's gesture of blurring the image when dealing with the trauma. And I think that approach is closer maybe to Sasnal. If we look at the next painting, please. We have another work based on the same film of Landsman's Shoah. And here you can see this face of the translator, also completely blurred, but her role as she was asking questions on behalf of Landsman and retelling and translating the answers of the witnesses, but also moderating that conversation. Her position became very blurry as someone who is giving the testimony. And I found a quote about the translator from an essay wrote by Katarzyna Bojarska 2 years ago, I think. And maybe I'll read it because it seems quite apt in terms of the ability to represent and the portraiture. So the translator is exposed on many levels in the film, and her role in the transmission of the narrative of Polish bystanders is far from neutral, innocent, or clear. In the painting, her face has no distinct features, nothing to get hold of except the blur. The blur here is the rupture, the impediment to communication. What are we to make of it? Why would the translator be of interest? Where are we today in relation to this figure, this culture, position? Are these two experiences of Holocaust, that of Jewish victims and survivors and Polish witnesses, bystanders, translatable to one another without being blurred? So I just think there's something there about Sasnal dealing with communication, whereas Richter still dealing with the medium of image and TV and photography. Yeah, but I'm improvising now a bit, but that seems to be.
I mean, they're also
showing.
You said correctly that they're working in different historical moments and different national contexts, each which has a different relationship to the subject matter of the Holocaust. It's just interesting to me that there is a formal relationship between Shoah Forest and the way in which paint is moved around the canvas, and some of the grey paintings where paint is also used. So obviously, as much as both artists are dealing with the history of the events, they're also dealing with the history of different types of brushwork, different types of paint handling that carry histories of who else has used them. I mean, another big difference is that they are both working at different points in terms of how much other cultural representations of the Holocaust have taken place. When Richter was working in the late 60s, early 70s, it was a period of, certainly in Germany, of silence around the 40s. But Sasnal is obviously working after the moment of several films, some of them made in Poland, and years after Landsman's Shoah was made. I mean, it often interests me, what are the delays that we see in artist practice between, you know, a moment of history and the moment where the artist chooses to engage with it. Both Richter and Sasnal made paintings of 9/11. Richter made it, I think, you know, several years after. Well, they both made it several years after. And I want to ask two things. What do you make of that delay for Sasnal between something that's happened in history and his moment of dealing with it? And specifically for this painting, why was it in 2003 that he turned to making paintings about Landsman's film?
Okay. So there is obviously the chronological delay, but I think there's something there about first of all, the discovery of certain histories for yourself. And it's quite important. It feels quite important that both Richter and Sasnal were about the same age when they started to address the topic. But of course, certain discussions around the Holocaust in Poland happened with delay.
Yeah.
So Shoah was, for instance, was screened in the Polish TV in the 80s when it was first made, but it was a very edited, it was a censored version. The discourse around Polish guilt didn't happen until I think late 80s, 90s. And then in 2001, Spiegel's Man's comic was first translated to Polish, and that was obviously a major source for Sasnal. So I think maybe that's the moment where he arrives to Shoah and revisiting it in 2003. It's already after he made his cycle around Maus, which was related exactly to publishing of the comic book in Poland, and the reaction it triggered, because it's triggered quite far-fetched, like right-wing radical reactions. So there's something about the delay of certain discourses in Poland, which still has impact on I think Sasnal's practice and much research up until this day. So that's to answer the first question. And now I forgot the second part of it.
There's one other kind of question that I want to ask before we move on to questions from the audience. If the controller can move forward the image one, if you and again and again and again, and there one back. Oh, sorry, to the polka constructivist. So and one more and one more. Okay, here. So you know, one of the things that I think is interesting about the relationship of abstraction and memory concerns different ways in which people have turned towards where the shape of the swastika. And I think one curious thing is that we tend to think that fascism did away with abstraction, that at least in terms of artistic tendencies, that the avant-garde abstraction of the 20s and 30s was very much attacked by Nazism. But Nazism actually sort of developed developed its own abstract symbol in the swastika and relied on the power of that shape to communicate itself. And in different national contexts, different artists have dealt with the swastika in different ways. In some national contexts, the image itself is, of course, illegal. And I mean, I think it's interesting that there's a group of works that Sasnal's made that have swastikas in them. You see them here. German artists have had different approaches to the swastika. I think there's a slide here of a polka painting, constructivist. If you can move on one, please. And again, and again, and again. No.
We lose it.
We've lost it. Well, it doesn't matter. I mean, just to carry on talking. Oh yeah, here. So in 1968, Polka made this extraordinary painting which kind of puts together the language of constructivism, one of the avant-gardes that Nazism supposedly gets rid of. But there's the inference of the swastika in this painting. Later on, Polka used the swastika very liberally across many different paintings. And I think there was a sort of joke painting as well that Martin Kippenberger made, where he did a sort of expressionistic abstract painting called "With the Best Will in the World, I Can't See a Swastika Here." I think Germans were dealing, when they used the swastika, were often dealing with, were wanting to get over the idea that they had to feel so guilty about the Holocaust if they themselves were generationally born afterwards. But back to Sasnal, why do you think he made that painting where the swastika turns into a penis?
I'm really happy that we tackled upon Polka and constructivist, because before I swastika by Polka and Sasnal. For Polka, it was a deeply transgressive gesture, right? It was the 60s in Germany. It referred to a taboo. So I think it was much stronger than for Wilhelm, because in Polish context, it is very much associated with the symbol of the enemy. It's not about the national guilt. It was also very present in anti-Western, anti-German, pro-Soviet propaganda in the movies. So Sasnal almost refers to it more as a symbol of this enemy of evil, but also from more of a pop perspective. And actually about this one, he basically wanted to show the impotence of swastika. He talks about it in one of the interviews, that the Nazis who identified with the idea of male strength were ashamed of being so weak that they hid their weaknesses behind the swastikas, and that's based on a quote with Sasnal. So this is, I think, like a more caricatural way of using the symbol, and look at this idea of male fantasies and male egos, which also has its backing in literature. But with those works, when you look at them, at where they are shown in the exhibition, there is an installation shot there. It's also, the symbol is quite clearly associated with some sort of ethical judgment. So there are two paintings there which refer to Degas. Maybe we can get back to the previous slide when we can see this shot from the exhibition. So the orange painting and the one closer to swastikas, that these are paintings referring to Degas, who's painted, like in terms of the painterly technique, is Sasnal's great master. But the first one is a caricatural portrait of two anonymous Jews. And the other one, the nude with swastika, incorporated in the composition, is actually hinting at Degas' anti-Semitism, which became very apparent when he started to be vocal around the Dreyfus affair. So in a way, Sasnal uses swastika here to point towards this tension within our canon of art history, or Western canon of art history, and the kind of the moral stand of those great masters that occupy the walls of the museums today. So I think he uses swastika as a dubious symbol of ethics, and it's maybe less loaded than in German context, but still quite easily readable for the audiences in Poland for sure. But what I actually really like about the Polka's painting, which is so brilliant on many levels, is the fact that he brings together this idea of modernism and the great social utopias, the modernity, which was the progress of society, and linked with the idea of the new, better world, and that also linked to the idea of new, better men, pure and healthy. And those ideas of purity of forms were developed hand in hand with eugenics at that time, and the ideas of race purity. So I think that's actually the interpretation of the Polka's work that is relevant for the Sasnal's dialogue with the pre-war avant-garde, how the relationship of modernism and its relationship to totalitarian regimes was constructing our societies back then that I found really interesting about polka painting. Yeah.
Thank you. We don't have any questions, so I'm just going to ask one other kind of question, which is, in one of the images that's kind of passed over the screen, I'm not going to try and find it, is Luc Tuymans' painting Gas Chamber, which was done in 1986. And my guess is that it's a painting that Sasnal will have known at one point. One of the things that's always interested me about this painting, you know, it's got a very kind of clunky materiality to it. It's quite small. It feels almost unfinished, almost unsure of itself whether it can be made. But nonetheless, it was made and it was exhibited, and it was not the only work where Tuymans is dealing with this type of history. But Tuymans, working out of Belgium, very much felt a right to make an image of a gas chamber. Gerhard Richter, who we've mentioned before, in some ways has spent his whole career realizing how impossible it would be to paint a gas chamber. He eventually made a series of works called Birkenau, which were started as attempts to make images of photographs made in Auschwitz, which he then overpainted and they turned into abstract paintings. All of this is leading me to say that different artists feel a sense of permission to use images associated with the suffering of Jews. Primarily, they're not the only people killed in the gas chambers, but primarily, with different degrees of self-policing or caution. So, you know, for Tuymans, relatively early on in his career, he feels it's okay to make a painting of a gas chamber, not so much for Richter. In the last few years, the kind of critical discussion of who has a right to make an image of whose history has really become very prominent and quite, in some cases, very bitter, where claims have been made that you are not really permitted to address the traumatic history of a people or a group other than your own. We know this from discussions in the United States. I was just wondering how those play out in Poland and how they might be felt for Sasnal as he makes choices in terms of the sort of historical images to work from. What sense of permission or caution do you think exists right now about what you can and can't make an image of from a culture that's not necessarily yours?
Yeah, I think the debates, as you say, are heated around it, and the debates around the appropriation of pain and trauma are very, very judgmental at the moment. And that's yeah. I'm not sure if this applies to Sasnal, even though I was asking the same questions. There is a kind of quote that he tends to use while speaking exactly to those issues, the issues of representation, of speaking of somebody's behalf, and I think he used Gross's quote of like that the fact that the Polish people need to do that for themselves rather than in the name of someone. So I think, and it would be great to have Wilhelm here, but hence his focus on the narrative and communication and transmitting the history rather than representing pain and trauma, because he's not speaking from the position of participant, victim, survivor, or even a witness. Yeah. He's speaking from this perspective of somebody participating in historical debate. And yet, when I looked at this painting, the gas chamber, and I remember seeing it for the first time years and years ago, and it made a great impression on me. But the way I look at it now, in the context of those debates, in the exhibition at Polin, there is a painting that Sasnal made of a prison cell in the regime of Khmer Rouge. I don't have the image here, but it's a very simple minimalist painting, and somehow it feels less strong because the addressing what happened in that chamber, in that prison cell, seems further away. It's so rooted in the discourse that Sasnal was primarily preoccupied with, that it almost calls for the reading through this Polish context and experience. So I think there's something about this, the strength of the painting, which comes through your personal relationship to the experience and the topic, and living within the debate and through the debate and through the memory of that experience. Yeah. Do we have a question there? Oh yeah, I have a question here from Tanya.
Yes. Can you explain what you mean about the misuse of abstraction?
Yes, and actually when I gave this presentation title, it was a while ago, and then when I revisited it, you might have seen that in the first slide, I actually removed the word abuse of abstraction, just because I asked myself the same question a couple of days ago. Does Sasnal really abuses abstraction? But I think for when I first titled the paper, The Uses of and Abuses of Abstraction, I was probably thinking more about my position of interpreting Sasnal's work through the abstract lens, because as I said at the beginning, I don't think he fits the category of an abstract painter. So it's, as much as we talk about abstract gesture in Sasnal's work, I think it was me critically abusing the term of abstraction in terms of reading of his practice, and hence I removed this from the title for today's presentation. So basically, yeah.
I mean, one thing I think, I'm looking at a painting now, we don't have it in our image, but it's the title. If you go to the Polin website, it's the painting that announces the exhibition. It's the painting which shows a bicycle in Auschwitz, essentially. And what is interesting about that painting is the difference between the way in which the watchtower and fence and landscape and clouds are painted, which all have a kind of degree of realism, and the bicycle, all of them are painted, I guess, in a way that you could say sort of connect to the way in which figurative painting usually exists in certainly in Sasnal's hands. And then the lower half of the painting is dominated by an area which is very pink, and that kind of stands for a pathway extending way into the different distance. Thank you, and like the ground. But if you were to imagine taking that pink section, taking away the bicycle, what you're left with is a kind of an abstract painting, which has a particular kind of paint handling, which is different from the way in which the green section of Shoah Forest is, but like has its own histories. With, at least if you know about the histories of abstract painting, what you're seeing in this pink section is a kind of, it relates to stain painting, and to histories of American 1960s abstraction, where the paint was applied very thinly in washes and left these sort of trails that were not made with brushes, but were made with sort of the liquidity of paint as it moves across the painting. Do you see? I don't know if that's kind of convincing, but essentially what I'm saying is that the path here is in some way almost like as if it's taken from another type of painting. It's taken from a kind of abstract painting, a color field painting, and in this painting, it's the path that extends right into the distance, but it's taken from a sort of abstraction. So it raises, for me, questions as to what does it mean to do that? Why is the path painted in this way rather than in the way of the rest of the painting? It's a very deliberate choice to have a sort of abstract pinky salmon painting dominating so much of this space. And it raises all sorts of questions, and it could be thought of as an abuse of abstraction. You know, what is abstraction? If this type of abstract painting was usually made to give optical pleasure to viewers in 1960s America, what is it doing when it becomes the path of Auschwitz? Do you see what I mean? So I think there's all sorts of interesting questions that he raises by having not just parts of paintings which are impossible to sort of find a meaning in, but to borrow something from a historical kind of abstract painting and insert it in a painting which is clearly connected to a geographical place.
Yeah, I think it's also an interesting dialogue between this pink path and the bicycle, the very schematically, realistically painted bicycle, which is almost there as an excuse to paint the background, which obviously is the topic of the painting. So there's something there about this abstract background and this very precise depiction of bicycle, which maybe is also gives us some answers to the question about the right to representation, like what kind of excuse Sasnal needs to represent. Is it abstraction, or is it just this banal figuration that is there?
Thank you. Well, we've come to the end of the hour, and I just wanted to say thank you so much, Kasia. It's been great to talk to you about Sasnal's works, and I think your paper raises brilliant questions. It was great to hear it, and thank you to everyone at the museum for hosting us and to the audience for listening to us. Kasia, is there anything you would like to add?
No, just thanks to you, Mark, for your brilliant questions and observations, and thanks to Pauline once again for organizing.